Jennifer Martinez, a 34-year-old pediatric nurse and mother of 2 young children, thought her biggest challenge was managing night shifts while her husband deployed overseas with the Marines. Then, Margaret Thornfield knocked on her door at 7:15 on a Tuesday morning, demanding she remove every rosebush from her front yard within 72 hours. What unfolded over the next 4 months would test everything Jennifer believed about home, community, and standing up for what's right. Before this story begins, consider, how well do you really know your neighborhood rules? This happened just 18 months ago in a planned community outside Phoenix. The family still lives there today. After hearing this, you'll never look at an HOA notice the same way again. Jennifer Martinez had planted her rose garden 3 weeks after moving into Sunset Ridge Commons, a meticulously planned community of 230 homes where every mailbox matched and every lawn maintained the same shade of green. The roses weren't just flowers to Jennifer. They were her sanctuary, her connection to her grandmother who had taught her to garden as a child, and her way of creating beauty during the loneliest deployment of her marriage. Her husband Carlos had been stationed in Kuwait for 8 months, leaving Jennifer to manage their household alone while working 12-hour shifts at Phoenix Children's Hospital. Their 7-year-old daughter Sophia asked every night when Daddy was coming home, while 4-year-old Miguel still set a place at the dinner table for his father. The rose garden had become Jennifer's meditation space, where she could process the weight of single parenting while deployed spouses served overseas. The roses themselves told a story of hope and resilience. Pink peace roses climbed a small trellis near the front window where Sophia liked to read. Deep red Mr. Lincoln roses created a border along the walkway, their velvet petals catching morning sunlight. White iceberg roses filled the corner bed, blooming continuously through Arizona's brutal summers. Jennifer had chosen each variety carefully, researching their heat tolerance and water requirements. She had invested over $800 and countless hours creating something beautiful for her family. The Sunset Ridge Homeowners Association had seemed reasonable when they purchased their home. The community featured a sparkling pool, well-maintained playgrounds, and tree-lined streets that made evening walks feel safe and peaceful. The monthly fees of $180 covered landscaping, common areas, pool maintenance, and what the brochures promised was preserving property values through thoughtful community standards. Jennifer had read the covenants, conditions, and restrictions document, all 47 pages, before signing their purchase agreement. The landscaping guidelines seemed straightforward. Maintain attractive front yard appearance, keep grass green and trimmed, avoid plants that might attract pests or create maintenance issues. Nothing specifically prohibited roses. In fact, the architectural guidelines included photographs of acceptable landscaping that featured flowering shrubs and decorative plantings. Margaret Thornfield had been HOA president for 6 years, elected repeatedly, on promises to maintain property values and community standards. A retired school administrator in her late 50s, Margaret lived alone in the community's largest home at the end of Oak Street, where she maintained what neighbors quietly called the museum lawn, perfectly manicured grass without a single flower or decorative element. Her dedication to community standards bordered on obsession, and newer residents quickly learned that Margaret noticed everything. The morning Margaret knocked on Jennifer's door, Sophia was eating cereal before school while Miguel played with toy trucks on the living room floor. Jennifer had just finished a 13-hour shift in the pediatric ICU, caring for children fighting serious illnesses, and had managed only 4 hours of sleep. The sharp, insistent knocking jolted her awake from the light doze she'd fallen into, while Miguel watched cartoons. Opening the door to find Margaret Thornfield holding an official-looking clipboard immediately triggered Jennifer's stress response. Margaret's silver hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and she wore a crisp white blouse with pressed khaki pants, her unofficial uniform for conducting HOA business. Her expression carried the cold authority of someone accustomed to immediate compliance. "Mrs. Martinez," Margaret began without greeting, "your front yard landscaping violates Section 4.2 of our community covenants. These roses constitute unauthorized plantings that were installed without architectural committee approval. You have 72 hours to remove them completely and restore the area to acceptable standards." Jennifer felt her heart sink as she processed Margaret's words. The roses had been growing for 8 months without any previous complaints. Neighbors regularly complimented the garden during their evening walks. The postal worker had mentioned how much she enjoyed the fragrance. Children from the neighborhood often stopped to smell the flowers on their way to school. "I'm sorry, I don't understand," Jennifer replied, her voice still thick with exhaustion. "The guidelines say flowering plants are acceptable, and I made sure everything was drought-tolerant and well-maintained. Is there a specific problem with roses?" Margaret's response was swift and dismissive. "The architectural committee never approved these plantings. All landscaping modifications require written approval before installation. Since you failed to follow proper procedures, the plants must be removed. This is clearly stated in the covenants you agreed to follow." Jennifer's mind raced through her memory of reading the HOA documents. She distinctly remembered sections about major modifications requiring approval. Things like pools, sheds, or extensive renovations. But flowers? The guidelines seemed to encourage attractive landscaping, and roses were hardly unusual in Arizona neighborhoods. "Could you show me the specific section you're referencing?" Jennifer asked, trying to keep her voice calm while Sophia listened from the kitchen. "I want to understand exactly what I missed, so I can make sure this doesn't happen again." Margaret's expression hardened at what she perceived as questioning her authority. "Mrs. Martinez, I don't have time to provide private tutoring on community standards. The violation notice contains all necessary information. Compliance is required within 72 hours or additional penalties will apply." As Margaret turned to leave, Jennifer felt a familiar surge of the protective instinct that made her effective in pediatric nursing. The same feeling she got when doctors dismissed concerned parents or when insurance companies denied necessary treatments for children. Something about Margaret's authoritarian approach and unwillingness to explain specific violations triggered every alarm bell in Jennifer's system. That evening, after putting the children to bed, Jennifer spread the HOA documents across her kitchen table and began reading with the same careful attention she gave medical protocols. The covenants were dense with legal language, but certain patterns emerged. Section 4.2 did require architectural committee approval for significant landscape modifications, but the definition of significant remained vague. The architectural guidelines included sample photographs of acceptable landscaping. Several images showed flowering shrubs, ornamental plants, and what appeared to be small garden areas. None of the prohibited modifications specifically mentioned flowers or roses. The more Jennifer read, the more convinced she became that her rose garden fell well within acceptable guidelines. Jennifer decided to request a formal hearing with the architectural committee to present her case. According to the covenants, homeowners had the right to appeal violation notices and present evidence supporting their position. She spent the weekend documenting her research, printing photographs of her well-maintained roses, and preparing a respectful presentation explaining why her garden should be considered compliant. The architectural committee meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday evening in the community center. Jennifer arranged childcare with her neighbor, a retired teacher named Dorothy Walsh, who had become a surrogate grandmother to Sophia and Miguel during Carlos's deployment. Dorothy had lived in Sunset Ridge Commons since the community opened, and had watched Margaret's increasingly rigid enforcement of rules over the years. "That woman has gotten worse every year she's been in charge," Dorothy confided while helping Sophia with homework. "When I first moved here, people were reasonable. Now Margaret acts like she's running a military base instead of a neighborhood." The community center meeting room felt more like a tribunal than a neighborly discussion. Margaret sat at the center of a long table with two other committee members: Kenneth Palmer, a retired insurance adjuster, and Brenda Richardson, a real estate agent who had sold several homes in the community. The room's fluorescent lighting cast harsh shadows, and the formal arrangement of chairs created an intimidating atmosphere. Jennifer presented her case methodically, explaining her research process, showing photographs of her well-maintained roses, and referencing specific sections of the architectural guidelines that seemed to support flowering plants. She emphasized her commitment to community standards and her willingness to make reasonable modifications if specific problems could be identified. The committee's response revealed the arbitrary nature of their enforcement. Kenneth Palmer acknowledged that the guidelines weren't entirely clear about flowers, but suggested that common sense should have led Jennifer to seek approval. Brenda Richardson expressed concern that allowing roses might encourage other homeowners to plant whatever they wanted, potentially impacting property values. Margaret's position remained absolute. Unauthorized plantings were violations regardless of their appearance or maintenance quality. She refused to consider grandfather clauses or compromise solutions. The roses must be removed completely, and the area restored to grass or approved ground cover. "Mrs. Martinez," Margaret stated with finality, Rules exist to protect everyone's investment in this community. When residents make unilateral decisions about landscaping, it opens the door to chaos. Your roses may be attractive, but they set a precedent we cannot allow. Jennifer left the meeting feeling frustrated and confused. The committee had acknowledged that the rules weren't clear, yet they refused to interpret them reasonably. Their concerns about precedent seemed disproportionate to a small rose garden maintained by a deployed military spouse working night shifts to support her family. Margaret's retaliation for Jennifer's challenge to the committee decision was swift and comprehensive. Within a week, Jennifer received multiple violation notices targeting different aspects of her property. Her mailbox, which had never been mentioned before, was suddenly the wrong shade of black. Sophia's sidewalk chalk art became unauthorized decorations on community walkways. The small decorative flag displaying her family's military pride was deemed inappropriate signage. Each violation carried a $50 fine, with escalating penalties for non-compliance. The notices arrived via certified mail, creating an atmosphere of constant legal pressure. Jennifer found herself checking her mailbox with dread, never knowing what new infraction Margaret might have discovered. The psychological impact on Jennifer's family was immediate and devastating. Sophia began asking why the mean lady was being cruel to Mommy, while Miguel became anxious whenever strangers approached their front door. Jennifer's stress levels, already elevated by managing single parenthood during deployment, reached dangerous peaks that began affecting her work performance and physical health. The financial pressure was equally concerning. Jennifer's salary as a pediatric nurse covered their basic expenses, but Carlos's deployment pay helped manage their mortgage and savings goals. The accumulating HOA fines threatened to consume the emergency fund they had carefully built to handle unexpected expenses during his absence. Dorothy Walsh emerged as an unexpected ally during this period. Having observed Margaret's enforcement patterns for years, Dorothy recognized the systematic harassment Jennifer was experiencing. She began documenting the timing and nature of violations, noting that Margaret seemed to target homeowners who questioned her authority. "I've lived here since this community opened," Dorothy explained during one of their evening conversations. "Margaret wasn't always like this. But power changes people, and she's been unchallenged for too long. Your roses are beautiful, and everyone knows this isn't really about landscaping." Dorothy's support provided both practical help and emotional validation. She offered to watch Sophia and Miguel during Jennifer's night shifts, ensuring the children had stability while their mother worked. More importantly, Dorothy's perspective helped Jennifer understand that Margaret's behavior reflected personal psychology rather than legitimate community concerns. As word of Jennifer's conflict with the HOA spread through Sunset Ridge Commons, the community began dividing into distinct factions. Many residents privately sympathized with Jennifer but feared challenging Margaret's authority. Others genuinely believed that strict rule enforcement protected property values and community standards. The division became visible during daily neighborhood interactions. Some neighbors continued their friendly evening conversations with Jennifer, expressing quiet support for her position. Others began avoiding eye contact or crossing the street to avoid uncomfortable discussions about the ongoing conflict. Jennifer discovered that she wasn't Margaret's first target. Frank Rodriguez, a retired plumber who lived 3 streets over, had been cited for his vegetable garden 2 years earlier. Susan Chen faced ongoing harassment for her children's outdoor play equipment. Several military families had received violations for flag displays or patriotic decorations. The pattern revealed Margaret's systematic targeting of residents who might challenge her interpretation of community standards. Military families, working parents, and anyone who questioned HOA decisions became subjects of intensified scrutiny and creative violation discoveries. Jennifer realized that her rose garden had become a symbol of broader issues within Sunset Ridge Commons. The conflict wasn't really about flowers or landscaping guidelines. It was about whether residents had any meaningful voice in interpreting the rules they were required to follow. Determined to protect her family and challenge Margaret's arbitrary enforcement, Jennifer began researching Arizona OA law and residents' rights. Her nursing background had taught her to approach complex problems systematically, gathering evidence and understanding underlying principles before developing treatment plans. Arizona's Planned Community Act provided specific protections for homeowners facing arbitrary HOA enforcement. Associations were required to apply rules consistently, provide clear violation descriptions, and offer reasonable hearing processes. Jennifer discovered that many of Margaret's enforcement practices violated state law requirements for due process and fair treatment. The research revealed that Jennifer's rose garden likely fell within acceptable landscaping guidelines under any reasonable interpretation of the covenants. Similar communities throughout Arizona routinely allowed flowering plants and decorative gardens without architectural committee approval. Margaret's absolute prohibition on roses appeared to exceed her authority under the community's governing documents. Jennifer also discovered that several of Margaret's violation notices contained procedural errors that made them legally invalid. Fines had been assessed without proper notice periods, hearings had been denied despite written requests, and violation descriptions lacked the specificity required by Arizona law. Armed with this legal research, Jennifer felt more confident about challenging Margaret's authority. But she also understood that legal technicalities alone wouldn't resolve the underlying conflict. She needed to build community support and demonstrate that Margaret's enforcement practices threatened everyone's property rights and peaceful enjoyment of their homes. Jennifer's research and documentation efforts attracted other residents who had experienced Margaret's arbitrary enforcement. Frank Rodriguez shared his experiences with vegetable garden harassment, including photographs of violation notices and Margaret's refusal to consider compromise solutions. Susan Chen described ongoing conflicts over her children's outdoor play equipment, including a swing set that had been installed with proper permits but later deemed a violation when Margaret decided the community needed stricter standards for children's equipment. Dorothy Walsh provided historical perspective, explaining how Margaret's enforcement had become increasingly rigid and personal over her years in office. Early in Margaret's tenure, violations were rare and typically involved genuine community concerns like excessive noise or property neglect. Recent years had seen violations become tools for enforcing Margaret's personal preferences rather than protecting legitimate community interests. The emerging support network began meeting informally in Dorothy's living room, sharing experiences and developing strategies for addressing Margaret's overreach. The group included military spouses, retirees, working parents, and long-term residents who had watched their community become increasingly authoritarian under Margaret's leadership. Jennifer found strength in discovering that her conflict wasn't personal or isolated. Margaret's behavior reflected systematic problems with unchecked HOA authority that threatened every resident's basic rights to reasonable enjoyment of their property. As Jennifer continued challenging violation notices and demanding proper hearings, Margaret's retaliation escalated dramatically. The accumulating fines reached over $800, threatening Jennifer's carefully managed family budget during Carlos's deployment. Margaret began conducting daily inspections of Jennifer's property, documenting minor issues that had never been violations before. The spacing between rose bushes became improper density. The small garden border stones were unauthorized hardscaping. Even the timing of Jennifer's lawn watering became subject to violation notices. The constant surveillance created unbearable stress for Jennifer's family. Sophia became reluctant to play in their front yard, afraid of attracting Margaret's attention. Miguel asked why the angry lady didn't like their house. Jennifer found herself timing family activities around Margaret's inspection schedule, feeling like a prisoner in her own home. The psychological toll began affecting Jennifer's work performance at the hospital. Her colleagues noticed increased anxiety and difficulty concentrating during critical patient care situations. The pediatric ICU demanded complete focus and emotional stability, qualities that were eroding under the constant pressure of HOA harassment. Jennifer realized that Margaret's strategy was working. The accumulating stress, financial pressure, and family disruption were designed to force compliance through exhaustion rather than legitimate rule enforcement. Margaret was systematically making Jennifer's life unbearable to discourage other residents from challenging her authority. The conflict reached its crisis point when Jennifer received notice that her accumulated violations and fines had triggered foreclosure proceedings. Arizona law allowed HOAs to place liens on properties for unpaid assessments and fines, potentially resulting in forced sale to recover debts. Jennifer stared at the foreclosure notice in disbelief. $800 in disputed fines for rose bushes and chalk art could potentially cost her family their home. The legal document threatened everything she and Carlos had worked to build for Sophia and Miguel's future. The foreclosure notice arrived just 3 days before Carlos was scheduled to return from deployment. Jennifer had planned to surprise the children by having their father arrive to a beautifully maintained home with roses blooming in the front garden. Instead, she faced the possibility of explaining why legal strangers might force them to move. That night, after putting the children to bed, Jennifer sat in her rose garden and called Carlos via video chat. Through tears, she explained the 8-month ordeal that had developed during his deployment. Carlos listened with growing anger and disbelief, as Jennifer described Margaret's systematic harassment and escalation. "I've been fighting for our country's freedom overseas," Carlos said, his voice tight with emotion, "while some petty dictator has been terrorizing my wife and children at home. This ends now." Carlos immediately began making calls to military family support services, veterans organizations, and legal assistance programs. The systematic harassment of a deployed service member's family qualified for multiple forms of advocacy and legal protection under federal and state law. Armed with Carlos's support and connections to military advocacy organizations, Jennifer launched a comprehensive challenge to Margaret's authority and the pending foreclosure. The Veterans Legal Aid Society provided free legal representation, recognizing the systematic targeting of military families within Sunset Ridge Commons. Jennifer's attorney, Maria Santos, had extensive experience with HOA disputes and immediately identified multiple legal violations in Margaret's enforcement practices. The foreclosure proceedings lacked proper documentation, violation notices contained procedural errors, and Margaret's selective enforcement violated Arizona's fair housing protections for military families. The legal challenge revealed that Margaret had exceeded her authority under the community's governing documents. The HOA board had never authorized the aggressive enforcement practices Margaret had implemented. Many residents were unaware that Margaret had been operating independently rather than following board-approved policies. Discovery proceedings required Margaret to produce documentation supporting her violation notices and enforcement decisions. Her records revealed inconsistent application of rules, personal animus toward residents who questioned her authority, and procedural violations that invalidated most of her recent enforcement actions. Jennifer's case became a catalyst for broader community organizing. Dorothy Walsh circulated petitions calling for Margaret's removal as HOA president and a return to reasonable enforcement of community standards. Frank Rodriguez and Susan Chen shared their experiences with local media, exposing the systematic harassment occurring within Sunset Ridge Commons. As news of Jennifer's legal challenge spread throughout Sunset Ridge Commons, long suppressed, resident frustrations with Margaret's authoritarian practices erupted into open revolt. Families who had quietly endured harassment began sharing their experiences and demanding change. The community center meeting room overflowed during an emergency HOA board meeting called to address the growing crisis. Residents who had never attended meetings before showed up to express outrage about Margaret's enforcement practices and support for Jennifer's family. Military spouses shared stories of harassment during deployments when families were most vulnerable and least able to fight arbitrary enforcement. Parents described children who had stopped playing outdoors due to fear of triggering violation notices. Elderly residents explained how Margaret's rigid interpretations had eliminated longtime community traditions and neighborly activities. The board members who had enabled Margaret's practices faced direct confrontation from residents demanding accountability. Kenneth Palmer and Brenda Richardson attempted to defend their committee decisions but found themselves overwhelmed by documented evidence of procedural violations and selective enforcement. Margaret's response to the community uprising revealed the depth of her psychological investment in controlling the neighborhood. She accused Jennifer of orchestrating a conspiracy to destroy property values and community standards. She characterized resident complaints as evidence that people wanted to live in chaos without rules or standards. The decisive confrontation occurred during a special board meeting held 3 weeks after Carlos returned from deployment. The community center was packed with residents, local media representatives, and veterans advocates who had taken interest in Jennifer's case. Carlos Martinez, still lean and intense from his deployment, addressed the board with military bearing and controlled anger. He described returning from 8 months of serving overseas to find his family terrorized by arbitrary harassment from their own community association. "I took an oath to defend the Constitution and protect American freedoms," Carlos stated, his voice carrying throughout the silent room. "I never imagined I'd need to defend my family from a petty dictator in our own neighborhood. My wife planted roses to create beauty while I was gone. Margaret Thornfield turned those flowers into weapons to attack my family." Jennifer's presentation was methodical and devastating. She documented 8 months of harassment, showing photographs of her well-maintained garden alongside Margaret's increasingly ridiculous violation notices. She presented evidence of procedural violations, selective enforcement, and psychological harassment that had affected her children's sense of safety in their own home. The legal documentation provided by Maria Santos revealed that Margaret's enforcement practices violated Arizona law in multiple ways. The threatened foreclosure lacked legal foundation, violation notices failed to meet procedural requirements, and Margaret's personal animus had contaminated the entire enforcement process. Margaret's defense crumbled under cross-examination. She could not explain why roses violated landscaping guidelines that explicitly encouraged flowering plants. She could not justify why identical situations resulted in different enforcement depending on whether residents questioned her authority. She could not produce board authorization for many of her most aggressive enforcement practices. The board vote to remove Margaret as HOA president was unanimous. Her replacement, Dorothy Walsh, had the community respect and institutional knowledge necessary to restore reasonable governance to Sunset Ridge Commons. Jennifer's violation notices were formally rescinded, and all associated fines were eliminated. The threatened foreclosure was dismissed, and the HOA agreed to pay Jennifer's legal costs as compensation for the harassment her family had endured. Margaret's removal triggered a comprehensive review of HOA enforcement practices. New policies required board approval for violation notices, established clear appeal procedures, and implemented safeguards against selective enforcement. Residents gained meaningful voice in interpreting community standards rather than submitting to arbitrary authority. The community healing process took months, but the transformation was remarkable. Neighborhood gatherings resumed, children played freely in common areas, and families felt secure in making reasonable improvements to their properties. The fear that had dominated Sunset Ridge Commons during Margaret's tenure was replaced by renewed sense of community and mutual respect. Jennifer's rose garden became a symbol of the community's renewal. Neighbors regularly stopped to admire the flowers that had triggered such conflict, often commenting on how beautiful the garden looked and how much they had missed seeing families enjoy their outdoor spaces without fear. Today, 3 years after the Rose Garden War ended, Sunset Ridge Commons thrives as a genuinely welcoming community. Dorothy Walsh's leadership as HOA president emphasizes reasonable enforcement of necessary rules while respecting residents' rights to enjoy their homes peacefully. Jennifer continues working as a pediatric nurse while serving on the HOA board's architectural committee. Her experience with arbitrary enforcement has made her a fierce advocate for fair treatment and reasonable interpretation of community standards. She ensures that future violations are based on genuine community concerns rather than personal preferences or power games. Carlos completed his military service and now works as a veterans advocate, helping military families navigate housing discrimination and HOA conflicts. Their experience in Sunset Ridge Commons taught them that freedom requires constant vigilance even in suburban neighborhoods where threats come from petty tyrants rather than foreign enemies. Sophia and Miguel, now 10 and 7, help their mother tend the rose garden that nearly cost their family everything. The children understand that their parents fought for something more important than flowers. They fought for the right to call their house a home without fear of arbitrary persecution. The roses themselves have flourished beyond Jennifer's original vision. The pink peace roses climb higher each year. The Mr. Lincoln roses create a stunning border that draws compliments from every visitor, and the white iceberg roses bloom continuously, symbolizing the hope and resilience that carried Jennifer's family through their darkest period. Margaret Thornfield moved away from Sunset Ridge Commons 6 months after her removal as HOA president. Her departure marked the end of an era when fear and arbitrary authority dominated community life. Residents rarely mention her name, preferring to focus on the positive changes that followed her exit from leadership. Jennifer's story resonates because it illuminates universal truths about home, community, and the courage required to stand up for what's right. Every homeowner understands the vulnerability of having their sanctuary threatened by arbitrary authority. Every parent recognizes the fierce protectiveness Jennifer felt when her children's sense of safety was attacked. The Rose Garden War wasn't really about landscaping or HOA rules. It was about basic human dignity and the right to live peacefully in one's own home. Jennifer's victory represented something larger than personal vindication. It proved that ordinary citizens can successfully challenge abusive authority when they find the courage to stand up for their principles. The story also demonstrates how quickly communities can transform when residents reclaim their voice in local governance. Margaret's authoritarian reign seemed permanent and insurmountable, yet it crumbled Quickly, once residents found the courage to organize and demand change, Jennifer's roses continue blooming each spring, their beauty enhanced by the knowledge that they were nearly destroyed by someone who confused power with authority. The garden serves as a living reminder that sometimes the most ordinary acts, planting flowers, caring for family, standing up for neighbors, become extraordinary when they're done with courage and conviction. If this situation unfolded in your neighborhood, would you find the courage to stand up like Jennifer Martinez did? Sometimes protecting what matters most requires us to discover strength we never knew we had. The Rose Garden War reminds us that home isn't just about property rights or investment values. It's about the fundamental human need for sanctuary, beauty, and dignity in the places where we raise our families and build our lives. Jennifer Martinez planted roses to create beauty during her husband's deployment. She never imagined those flowers would become the catalyst for reclaiming her community from tyranny. Her story proves that ordinary people doing ordinary things, like caring for gardens and protecting families, can achieve extraordinary results when they refuse to surrender their basic human rights to petty dictators who mistake authority for power. The roses still bloom in Sunset Ridge Commons, tended by a family who learned that sometimes the most important battles are fought not on distant battlefields, but in our own front yards, defending the simple right